Okay, let's go. Number 1. The Pit of Bones. You are a paleoanthropologist at the end of a rope, descending a 43-foot vertical shaft through limestone karst in the Sierra de Atapuerca, in the Castile and Leon region of northern Spain. The year is 1984. Juan Luis Arzuaga has begun the systematic excavation of this site, and the passage is narrow enough that your shoulders brush stone on both sides as you descend. The shaft is called the Cima de los Huesos, the Pit of Bones, and as you go down the smell reaches you before any visual does. Cold clay, still air, the absence of anything organic. There is no decay in the air, no moisture from a living system, no biological trace of any kind. The circle of light above you shrinks as you go. When your feet touch the floor, the torch shows you the sediment. The floor is bones. Not the scattered remnants of a single creature dragged into a crevasse. Not partial remains tumbled by floods or predators across geological time. Bones deposited in stratified layers organized by time, organized by geology, representing a minimum of 28 individual human beings. They are Homo heidelbergensis, an archaic member of the genus Homo, anatomically distinct from both modern humans and Neanderthals. Uranium series dating of calcite flowstones and paleomagnetic analysis of the surrounding sediment, published by Arzuaga and his colleagues in Nature in 1993, places their age at approximately 430,000 years. As of the most recent published reports, the team has extracted more than 6,500 individual bone and tooth fragments from this shaft alone. This is the largest collection of Homo heidelbergensis material on Earth, more than all other known sites combined. Now you begin to document what is not here. No animal bones, no fire, no tools. In virtually every Pleistocene archaeological deposit of comparable age and depth in Europe, the skeletal material of large mammals, cave bears, hyenas, deer appears in significant quantities, either as prey, as predator cache, or as opportunistic accumulation. Not here. There is no food debris. No combustion evidence, no charcoal, no heat-altered bone, no ash lens in any stratigraphic layer. No worked flint, no scraper, no barren, no core, no debitage. None of the lithic material that consistently accompanies human habitation or food processing at this period. The absence is total, and it is specific. The Cima de los Huesos was not a place where anyone lived, ate, worked, or sheltered. This is not where anyone lived. This is where they brought their dead. They returned here across a span the uranium series dating places at tens of thousands of years. The decision to return required sustained cultural knowledge of the shaft's location, sustained collective understanding of its purpose, and sustained willingness to manage the 43-foot descent with a body. Nothing about this site was incidental. Nothing about this deposit was accidental. Among thousands of biological fragments on the floor of this shaft, there is one object that is not biological. It is a bifacial hand axe, worked on both faces in the Acheulean tradition, roughly symmetrical, approximately 7 inches long. It is red quartzite. The geological survey of the surrounding Atapuerca terrain does not identify red quartzite as a local material. The nearest known sources of quartzite of this specific color and composition lie at a significant distance from the site. The hand axe was transported here deliberately, from elsewhere. The axe shows no use wear. The edges are not dulled in the micropatterns produced by cutting, scraping, or striking any material. It was not a used tool that was later deposited. It arrived at the bottom of this shaft, having never served the function tools of its type served. Arzuaga's research team gave it an informal name that has appeared in his own academic publications on the site, Excalibur. Here's where it gets strange. The Atapuerca research team has published extensively on the skeletal material in the Cima de los Huesos paleopathology, population genetics, isotopic chemistry, comparative anatomy, decades of rigorous scholarship on what the bones contain and what they reveal. The hand axe appears in those publications. It is not concealed. But no peer-reviewed paper from the team has advanced and defended a formal interpretation of why the object is here. Arzuaga has addressed the question in public interviews and documentary footage, describing the hand axe as probably a funerary offering. That phrase, or any equivalent interpretive commitment regarding intentional mortuary behavior, specifically associated with this object, does not appear in any peer-reviewed publication from the team. The gap between what is said publicly and what is committed to in print is not a product of ignorance. It is a product of the standard of evidence required to make that claim in the peer-reviewed record. The 28 individuals were transported here. The access route, a 43-foot vertical shaft with no other entry point, required not only carrying bodies, but organizing the descent. The hand axe was carried here from a quarry source at a significant distance and placed here without being used here. The sediment stratigraphy implies that this activity recurred over a span the dating indicates was measured in tens of thousands of years. The deepest sediment layers at the base of the shaft have not been fully excavated. Ars Wages published reports confirm the stratigraphic sequence continues below the current excavation floor. What lies beneath the current floor is not documented, because that layer has not been removed. Excalibur is held in a climate-controlled environment at the Museum of Human Evolution in Burgos. Access to the shaft is restricted to authorized researchers affiliated with the Atapuerca Research Project. The deepest sediment layer at the bottom of the Cima de los Husos remains in place, undisturbed, at the base of a 43-foot shaft, reachable only by rope. Number 2. The Oracle Galleries. You are an initiate being led through a narrow underground corridor beneath the Andes highlands, at Chavan de Huántar, in the Ancash region of what is now northern Peru. The year is approximately 900 BC. The priests who carry the single torch ahead of you have walked this passage before. You have not. The passage is not wide enough to extend both arms. The ceiling is low enough that taller persons must bow their heads. The stone walls are cold against your fingertips when you reach to steady yourself. The darkness behind you is absolute. The darkness ahead exists only as a radius of firelight that moves with the priests, which means the shadows move, which means the walls appear to shift at the edge of what you can see. Then a priest blows a pututu. A pututu is a conch shell horn spondylus shell, cut and shaped to sustain tonal output. When blown inside these passages, the sound it produces does not come from the shell. It comes from the walls. It comes from the floor. It comes from no single locatable point of origin. The sound appears to arrive from every surface simultaneously, then from none of them, then from behind you, though the person blowing the instrument is ahead of you. You cannot locate the sound in space. This is not an accident of construction. The passage geometry was designed to produce this effect. Stanford University archaeologist John Rick, who has led systematic study of Chavan de Huántar since the 1990s, worked with acoustical engineer David Lubman to document the site's acoustic properties. Their findings were discussed in a 2008 article in Smithsonian Magazine, which described the gallery system as engineered for sound disorientation. The angles of the passages, the placement of ceiling breaks, the dimensions of the side corridors taken together, these ensure that a sound generated at any single point within the gallery network cannot be localized by a human listener standing inside that network. The underground gallery system at Chavan de Huántar extends approximately 35,000 square feet beneath the visible ceremonial structures, the footprint of a large modern building, carved into the bedrock beneath a monument visible for miles across the highland plain at 10,170 feet above sea level. The galleries are old. They predate or are contemporary with the surface structures rising above them. At the intersection of the primary and secondary corridor axes, in permanent darkness, no configuration of torch placement useful for navigation can reach this chamber stands the lanzon. The lanzon is a carved granite monolith, 15 feet tall, tapering to a point at its base and widening at its crown. The figure carved into its surface has a fanged mouth, clawed extremities, and a body configuration that corresponds to no animal species identified in the Andean archaeological record, and to no known deity in the reconstructed Chavan iconographic system. It stands at the point where the acoustic disorientation is most complete, where a sound has no recoverable source, where the torch is most likely to gutter in the drafts moving through the corridors. Analysis of ceramic ritual vessels from the site, conducted by researchers at the University of New Hampshire, identified residue consistent with San Pedro cactus, the primary mescaline-bearing plant in the Andean ceremonial tradition. The ceramics were used in the galleries. Mescaline at ceremonial dosage produces altered auditory and spatial perception, specifically degrading the ability to locate the source of sounds and the stability of peripheral vision in low-light conditions. The gallery system was not designed around intoxication. Intoxication was added to a system already designed to prevent spatial orientation. The two effects compound. A person whose auditory localization is already structurally degraded by the passage. geometry loses additional spatial processing capacity as the mescaline takes effect. The machine Rick named performs the same function by two simultaneous mechanisms. Here's where it gets strange. Rick described the gallery network at Chavandohonter as a machine for producing religious experience in the 2008 Smithsonian article. He meant this as an archaeological characterization, a precise description of the engineering intentionality behind the acoustic disorientation. Every element of the system serves one function: to place a person underground, in the dark, unable to locate any sound, while the Lanzon occupies the chamber that cannot be lit. Rick did not describe what the innermost gallery branches of that machine contain. The Lanzon chamber is documented. The main corridor system is mapped. Several branch passages have been measured. The innermost branches have not been the subject of any published spatial or acoustic analysis. Access to the gallery network requires clearance from Peru's Ministry of Culture, and the branches beyond the Lanzon are classified in the site's administrative documentation as structurally sensitive. Clearance for those branches has not been extended to any research team in any documented investigation. The Pututu was not played in these passages for the benefit of the priests. It was played for the initiate, the person positioned in total darkness, already past the point of spatial certainty, already unable to find the walls with sound. The Lanzon occupied the chamber the initiate was moving toward. The branches extended beyond it, into the bedrock, unmapped. In darkness the torch could not penetrate. What acoustic properties those branches hold, whether the disorientation compounds or resolves, whether the passages terminate or continue, is not established in any published record. The measurements that would answer that question require access. Access requires ministry clearance. That clearance has not been granted. The Lanzon stands in its original position in the dark at the convergence point. It has not been moved. It does not require securing because the people who placed it precisely enough that it has held its position for approximately 3,000 years without assistance. The innermost branches of the system Rick called a machine extend beyond it, unmeasured, into rock that has not been entered in any documented investigation. Number 3. The crypts of Dendera. You are an epigraphist attached to the French Archaeological Mission at Dendera, working under Sylvie Coville in the temples of Upper Egypt. The year is 1997. Coville has begun the systematic documentation of the underground chambers beneath the Temple of Hathor, a project that will become the most complete scholarly record of those rooms ever produced. To reach the chamber you are working in today, you pass through a concealed floor panel in the temple's inner sanctuary, then moved along a carved stone channel barely wide enough for a single person, the ceiling pressed close above your shoulders. The walls on both sides were already carved reliefs beginning almost immediately in the passage, lit only by your handheld torch, detailed enough that you slowed your pace despite the narrowness of the corridor. The temperature dropped as you descended into the bedrock. The air was still. It has been still for a very long time. The Temple of Hathor at Dendera is one of the best preserved temple complexes in Egypt. Its construction began under Ptolemy XII in approximately 54 BC and continued through the early Roman period. Above ground, the complex is fully mapped, fully documented, and fully accessible to tens of thousands of visitors each year. The hypostyle hall, the roof chapel, the exterior walls, all of it is in the published record and in the tourist documentation. The underground chambers are in neither. Beneath the main temple floor, carved directly into the bedrock, are 12 underground chambers. The Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities classifies them as crypts of functional designation, covering a range of possible ancient uses. They are not tombs in the burial sense. No human remains have been documented in them. The scholarly characterization holds them as storage rooms for sacred objects and spaces used for ritual purposes that have not been fully characterized. They are not listed in the temple's visitor documentation. Access requires specific written authorization from the Ministry of Antiquities in Cairo. Coville's documentation work for the Institut Français d'Archéologie Orientale produced a comprehensive epigraphic record of the crypt walls. These walls are covered with carved relief images, figures, objects, architectural representations, and hieroglyphic inscriptions executed with a precision and preservation quality exceptional, even by Dendera's generally high standards. The reliefs are clear. They are not damaged. The disagreement is not about legibility. The disagreement is about what the legible images represent. In Crypt South 1, the most intact of the 12 chambers, carved figures depict elongated forms enclosed within ovoid or cylindrical shapes. The forms show eternal features, filaments, layered detail, structures that suggest internal complexity rather than simple geometric outline. Coville's interpretation, published in her documentation of the site and endorsed by the Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities as the official scholarly position, identifies these forms as lotus buds enclosed within papyrus barks, a symbol present in other Egyptian funerary and ritual contexts. This interpretation connects the imagery to a documented symbolic vocabulary. A second interpretive position exists in the scholarly community. It has been presented at academic conferences. It proposes a different identification for the enclosed forms and their internal structures. That interpretation has not appeared in a peer-reviewed journal. Because it has not been published at that level, it cannot be formally engaged, refuted, or confirmed through the standard academic process. Here's where it gets strange. Coville's interpretation carries the authority of the Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities, which means it carries administrative authority over the physical site. Access to Crypt South 1 requires written authorization from the ministry in Cairo. That authorization is not a bureaucratic formality. It is a genuine restriction that determines who may examine these reliefs, under what conditions, and with what instruments. An independent researcher who wishes to reach their own interpretive conclusions cannot do so without ministry clearance. The reader must be authorized before reading. This means the disagreement lotus buds in papyrus barks, or something else, cannot be independently tested by any researcher who has not been granted that clearance. The stone is clear. The images are readable. The disagreement is not about what the lines show, but the question of what those lines represent cannot be resolved by any investigator who lacks official permission to stand in the chamber and look. The number of researchers who have received that authorization in the past decade has not been publicly disclosed by the Ministry of Antiquities. Coville's documentation is meticulous and extensive. The volumes she produced represent the most thorough available published record of the Dendera crypts. Her interpretive framework is the one that appears in every publicly accessible scholarly reference to these chambers. It may be correct. It also cannot be independently tested by researchers who lack ministry clearance, and that clearance has not been extended to any documented independent team in recent years. The configuration of access produces a specific situation: carvings whose meaning is disputed, in a space whose entry is controlled by the institution, whose official position is one of the two interpretations, evaluated by scholars who cannot independently examine the primary material. This is not an allegation of concealment. This is a description of the access structure as it currently operates. The crypts are not listed in the temple's official visitor documentation. The Temple of Hathor at Dendera receives substantial tourist traffic each year. The hypostyle hall is photographed thousands of times each day. The zodiac ceiling, a reproduction, the original held in the Louvre, is among the most studied architectural details in Egyptian archaeology. The underground chambers do not appear in official visitor materials and are not listed as accessible areas. They are characterized in ministry documentation as restricted. The contrast is not incidental. The most legible parts of the Dendera complex are the most visited, the most disputed parts are the most inaccessible. The carved stone remains in the bedrock beneath the temple floor, lit only by whatever light is carried in, its interpretation officially settled and independently unverifiable, in a chamber that cannot be entered without paperwork processed in Cairo. Number 4. The Casta Tomb. You are a field archaeologist assigned to the excavation team under the direction of Caterina Peresteri, on an agricultural plain outside the city of Amphipolis, in the Sais regional unit of northern Greece. The year is 2014. The Casta tumulus has stood in this landscape for over 2,000 years. Before any excavation began, its profile suggested a structure of unusual size, a mound with too much volume to be incidental, rising from flat farmland in a way that suggested engineering rather than geology. Then the outer layers came off, and the scale of what was underneath revised every expectation on the site. Walk the Parabolos wall before you enter anything. The enclosure wall that defines the boundary of the Casta tomb complex measures 1,600 feet in circumference. That is longer than 5 American football fields placed end to end. The wall was built of dressed marble, fitted at a quality of construction consistent with royal commission. Peresteri described it at a press conference in 2014 as unique in the Greek world. No other known ancient Greek tomb has an enclosure wall of this length. The previous largest known example is substantially shorter. You spend several minutes walking the exterior of the Parabolos wall before you reach the entrance. The scale tells you something before the interior tells you anything. At the entrance, two colossal marble sphinxes, facing outward toward the approaching visitor, the standard protective configuration for high-status Macedonian funerary monuments. Behind the sphinxes, a caryatid colonnade lines the passage, female figures in marble functioning as structural columns. Their faces are damaged not by time but by deliberate defacement, the kind carried out by later occupants of a territory who wished to neutralize the protective power they believed such figures held. The damage is intentional. Past the caryatids, the antechamber floor carries a mosaic. The mosaic depicts the abduction of Persephone by Hades. The god seizes the goddess and descends with her into his domain. The composition is executed in polychrome stone, multiple colors of tesserae, arranged into motion and depth at a quality of craft consistent with work commissioned for members of the Macedonian royal family in the late 4th century BC. The subject is specific. For the floor of a funerary monument, the choice of a ruler descending into the domain of death is not incidental. You read the floor before you go further. The innermost chamber contains human bones, not in a sarcophagus, not arranged, scattered. The bones are distributed across the stone floor in a pattern that the Greek Ministry of Culture, in its 2014 announcement, documented as inconsistent with simple looting. A thief removing metal or ceramic objects disturbs burial contents in predictable ways. The scatter pattern here does not match those patterns. The bones were displaced in antiquity by someone who entered the innermost chamber for reasons that have not been established. Forensic analysis was conducted. The remains belong to a minimum of 5 individuals. At least one adult male, at least one adult female, an infant, and additional individuals whose age and sex were not specified in the public communication. Forensic analysis established what the bones contain. It established the minimum population, the demographic distribution, and the biological relationship of the remains to each other. It did not establish whose bones they are. The ministry issued its announcement regarding the bone count in 2014. No further official statement on the identity question has been issued since 2015. The tomb's construction is dated to 325 to 300 BC. Alexander the Great died in Babylon in 323 BC. The tomb was constructed within 2 years of that death. The overlap is documented chronological fact. A monument built at a scale and quality with no parallel in the known Greek world, constructed within 2 years of the death of the most powerful individual in the region, decorated with a mosaic depicting a ruler's descent into the domain of death. Located in the heartland of Macedonian territory, this tomb exists. The 5 individuals whose bones are scattered on its innermost floor have no recorded names. Here's where it gets strange. Ground-penetrating radar surveys of the Casta complex, conducted as part of the site investigation, identified sealed interior chambers within the mound that have not been opened. The surveys were completed. Their findings were acknowledged in ministry communications. The chambers identified by the radar have not been entered. No statement has been issued explaining why the chambers identified by the radar survey have not been entered. The stated reason, in the available ministry documentation, is ongoing preservation and stabilization work. The scale of the parabolos wall, the sphinxes, the caryatids, the quality of the Persephone mosaic, the marble in every layer of this structure taken together, this represents an investment that corresponds, in the Macedonian archaeological record, to a specific tier of individual for whom a monument of this magnitude would be commissioned. The identities of the 5 people whose bones are scattered across the innermost chamber floor remain officially unaddressed. The interior chambers identified by the radar surveys that have not been opened remain closed. Access to the Casta site is restricted to authorized researchers. The ministry's restriction on the sealed chambers is current. The bones on the innermost floor have no names. The rooms behind the walls, found by the radar and left unopened, have not been entered by anyone working in the present century. The parabolos wall stands in the Amphipolis plain, its marble still visible in sections above grade, enclosing a structure whose occupant was important enough to warrant 600 feet of dressed marble enclosure, 2 colossal sphinxes, a caryatid colonnade, and a polychrome royal mosaic, and whose identity has not been stated in any official communication since 2015. Access to the site remains restricted. The preservation and stabilization work cited as the reason for that restriction has not produced a published timeline for when the sealed chambers will be entered. Number 5. The Serapeum. You are Auguste Mariette, French Egyptologist, and the year is 1851. You are standing at the edge of a depression in the sand on the Saqqara Plateau, at the western margin of the Nile Valley, 15 miles south of Cairo, and you have just found what Strabo described 2,000 years ago. In the 1st century BC, the Greek geographer Strabo wrote in his geography about a temple at Saqqara with a sphinx-lined approach, some of the sphinxes buried to the neck, some to the head, connected to underground chambers used in rites associated with the Apis bull cult. Mariette had spent months following that description. The Sphinx Alley led to an entrance that had been sealed since the Roman period. When the seal breaks, the air that comes out is cold and dry and absolutely still, the air of a space that has not moved in approximately 1,700 years. He descends by torchlight. The tunnels carved into the limestone bedrock at Saqqara were begun under Ramesses II, approximately 1279 BC, and extended across subsequent centuries of pharaonic administration. The main gallery runs approximately 1,100 feet from its entrance into the plateau. Side galleries branch from the main axis at intervals. Some of those branches were mapped in the 19th century. Some have not been mapped in any documented survey since. Along the main gallery and its branches, 24 black granite sarcophagi are positioned in niches carved to receive them. The granite was quarried at Aswan, approximately 500 miles south of Saqqara. Each sarcophagus body weighs between 60 and 100 tons. The lids weigh approximately 27 tons each. The interior volume of each box is approximately 100 cubic feet. These objects were transported from Aswan to Saqqara 500 miles, then lowered through shafts in the bedrock barely wide enough to admit them, and positioned in niches cut with minimal clearance. The lid is 27 tons. The box is empty. The surface flatness deviation across the interior is less than 1/10,000th of an inch. That measurement comes from Christopher Dunn, a manufacturing engineer with experience in precision industrial machining, who documented his measurements of the Serapeum boxes in the 1990s and published his findings in the Giza power plant in 1998. His measurement methodology and reported tolerances have been contested in terms of their implications, not in terms of their accuracy. The flatness he recorded, less than 1/10,000th of an inch of deviation across the interior length of the box, is a tolerance not routinely achievable by industrial surface grinding until the mid-20th century. It is achievable today in aerospace manufacturing contexts using specialized controlled equipment in thermally stable environments. The conventional Egyptological interpretation of the Serapeum, that it functioned as a burial site for the sacred Apis bulls, the living incarnations of the god Ta venerated in the Memphis tradition, accounts for the tunnel system and the general architectural investment. It does not account for the machining precision. The Apis bull cult is attested in multiple historical and epigraphic sources. Apis bulls were ceremonially significant animals, their death and burial carefully managed events in the Memphis theological calendar. A bull burial requires a sealed container of sufficient size. It does not require a container whose interior surfaces are flat to tolerances that challenge 20th century precision manufacturing. That gap between what the stated purpose requires and what the machining achieved has not been formally addressed in any published Egyptological analysis. Of the 24 sarcophagi, the overwhelming majority were found empty or with negligible traces of biological material. 2 contained fragmentary organic material consistent with animal remains. The lids are seated in their original positions. They have not been lifted in any documented investigation since the ancient period. Here's where it gets strange. Mariette was not a credulous observer. He was not a traveler writing adventure accounts for a popular audience. He was the man who would go on to found the Egyptian Antiquities Service, one of the most rigorous institutional frameworks for archaeological management in the 19th century. His professional record is one of systematic documentation, skeptical assessment of claimed discoveries, and careful separation of evidence from speculation. His field notes from the Serapeum include accounts of specific observations made in sealed tunnel branches that had not been entered since the Roman period. Those accounts are designated separately from his standard excavation documentation. They are referenced in secondary sources. Scholars writing about Mariette in the decades after his death noted their existence and described their general character. They have not been published in full. They have not appeared in any peer-reviewed publication or archival release in any language. Mariette died in 1881. His complete field notes are held in a repository in Paris. The accounts from the sealed branches remain unpublished. Egyptian Antiquities Authority survey work conducted in the 20th century identified additional gallery branches at the Serapeum site branches not entered by Mariette's team in 1851. These branches are not the subject of any documented excavation conducted since Mariette's time. Their contents are not known. They are mapped by the instruments that found them and left alone. The main gallery of the Serapeum is accessible to tourists, who can walk the central passage and observe the niches where the sarcophagi sit in their positions. The side branches are physically blocked by barriers placed for visitor management. The 27-ton lids are seated where they were placed in the ancient period. The boxes are empty. Mariette's notes describing what he found in the sealed sections of this place, on first entry in 1851, remain in a repository in Paris, unreproduced and without a published timeline for release. The additional branches identified in 20th century survey work have not been entered in any documented campaign since Mariette's time. They are in the limestone bedrock of the Saqqara Plateau, known by the instruments that mapped their outlines, and left alone in the dark beneath the western edge of the Nile Valley. Let me say one thing, and I won't bring it up again. All 50 places like this one are now one book, The Sealed Vault. Yours to keep, easy to gift, and the best way to support this channel. Links below. Let's get back to the video. Number 6. The Cave of Crystals. You are a miner employed by Industrias Penols, working in the lead and zinc extraction operations beneath the Chihuahuan Desert near the town of Nica, in the state of Chihuahua, Mexico. The year is 2000. A tunnel boring operation approximately 1,000 feet below the desert surface has just breached a wall. The first thing you register is the air. It comes through the breach under pressure, not wind, but the release of an enclosed environment into your tunnel. It is wet. The humidity hits your face and hands like a physical force. The temperature gauge your team carries reads 136 degrees Fahrenheit. Not warm. Not hot in the way a summer afternoon is hot. Hot in the way a functioning kiln is hot heat that closes the throat, that makes the act of drawing a full breath a deliberate effort. You look through the breach. What you are looking at is selenite gypsum. The crystals inside the chamber are transparent, the color of old ice, and they extend from the floor to the ceiling, and from wall to wall in configurations that take a moment to accept as natural formations. The largest reach 36 feet in length and 4 feet in width. They are not clustered randomly. They grow in intersecting arrays, crossing over and under each other, forming a landscape inside the cave that has no comparison in any other documented geological site on Earth. The formation time for crystals of this scale was established by Juan Manuel Garcia Ruiz and colleagues in a paper published in Geology in 2007. Approximately 500,000 years. Hot calcium sulfate-rich groundwater in sustained contact with cooler surface water, undisturbed, across that entire period. Nothing disturbed this place for 500,000 years. You disturbed it. Your team cannot work in the cave without cooling equipment. The scientific teams that follow you will use specialized suits with integrated ice packs, and they will have working windows of approximately 20 minutes per session before the heat load exceeds what the suits can manage. A person without protective equipment loses consciousness inside this chamber in approximately 10 minutes. The Cave of Crystals at Nica is not a place that invites extended study. It tolerates brief, equipped visits and refuses all others. In 2009, Dr. Penelope Boston of the New Mexico Institute of Mining and Technology, subsequently appointed director of NASA Astrobiology, Institute worked within the cave under those time constraints to extract samples from a specific feature of the crystals themselves. As the selenite gypsum grew across those 500,000 years, it enclosed microscopic pockets of the fluid it was growing from. These fluid inclusions are sealed within the crystal matrix ancient water, isolated from the outside environment at the moment of its entrapment, preserved in solid rock since then. Boston extracted material from those inclusions under laboratory conditions. The organisms she extracted were alive, not organic residue, not biochemical traces of past life. Living organisms, successfully revived under laboratory conditions and confirmed to be metabolically active. They had been in a state of metabolic stasis or some form of biological persistence that approximates stasis inside solid rock for a period Boston estimated at up to 50,000 years. The revival required laboratory conditions calibrated to approximate aspects of the fluid inclusion environment. Specific atmospheric composition, specific temperature parameters, specific nutrient availability. The organisms did not simply restart at room temperature. They required a translation of the conditions they had been sealed in. Boston provided that translation. They responded. Here's where it gets strange. Boston presented these findings at the 2017 annual meeting of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. At that presentation, she described the organisms as 40% genetically different from anything in the database. The database being the existing classification system for microbial life, which covers organisms from virtually every extreme environment on Earth. Deep-sea thermal vents, Antarctic ice, hypersaline lakes. Their nearest known relatives, Boston stated, are microbes from other extreme environments. They are not close. They are 40% different. The presentation described findings. The peer-reviewed paper that would document those findings in full complete genetic sequencing data, metabolic characterization, and the mechanism by which organisms sustain any form of active biological state inside solid rock across tens of thousands of years has not appeared in the scientific literature. What Boston described at the AAA's meeting in 2017 is the summary of research whose full characterization is not in the published scientific record. In 2017, Industrias Panoles shut down the pumping operations that had kept the cave accessible since the discovery. The mine was decommissioned. The pumps went off, and the groundwater, the same hot, mineral-rich water that grew those crystals across 500,000 years, returned. The cave is now under approximately 60 feet of groundwater at 136 degrees Fahrenheit and 99% humidity. The sediment layers on the cave floor accumulated across the same 500,000-year period during which the crystals grew. That sediment was never properly collected or analyzed. That record was never collected. It is sealed beneath superheated water in a chamber accessible only by passing through rock that would require drilling to breach, inside an industrial zone that has been permanently decommissioned. The crystal cave at Nika is permanently inaccessible. The organisms Boston extracted and revived from the crystal matrix have not been fully characterized in any published record. The organisms are in a laboratory, genetically 40% different from anything with a name in the scientific literature, and the cave that held them for 50,000 years is now under 60 feet of water with no pump running and no door open. Number 7. The burial halts of Nan Madol. You are an officer aboard a German colonial survey vessel operating in the waters of Micronesia, and the year is 1910. The vessel has been tasked with administrative documentation of German colonial territory in the Pacific, which includes the Caroline Islands. You are anchored at the eastern reef margin of an island called Pohnpei, and the structure on the reef ahead of you does not fit the documentation forms your administration uses for any category of construction in the Pacific. Nan Madol occupies approximately 170 acres of reef flat and shallow lagoon water. It is not a natural formation. Approximately 92 artificial islets have been built here from columnar basalt volcanic rock that fractures naturally into roughly hexagonal prisms stacked in log cabin fashion to create walls, platforms, channels, and enclosed spaces. Individual basalt logs in the construction weigh up to 50 tons each. The total mass of basalt incorporated into the Nan Madol complex has been estimated at approximately 827,000 short tons. The quarry sites for this material are located approximately 20 miles away, on the main island of Pohnpei, on the far side of an open water crossing. No mechanism for moving 50-ton basalt columns across 20 miles of open water has been demonstrated or replicated. This is not a matter of scholarly uncertainty about a plausible method, it is a documented gap. No experimental archaeology project has successfully transported a basalt log of this mass across open water using the materials and methods available to the builders of Nan Madol during its construction period, approximately 1200 to 1500 AD, when it functioned as the ceremonial and administrative capital of the Saudeleur dynasty. The gap is acknowledged in the archaeological literature. It remains open. The islet called Nandawas is the royal mortuary complex of Nan Madol. Its walls reach 25 feet in height. The burial vaults within the complex are sealed with stone capstones, not stones placed as simple lids, but multi-ton. Blocks that required significant organized labor to install and that have not been moved by any archaeological team. Each capstone weighs more than a fully loaded freight truck. The capstones are in their original positions. Before your survey vessel arrived, other visitors produced written accounts of the vaults. Frederick William Christian, a British ethnologist, visited Pohnpei in 1897 and again in 1899. He published his findings in the Caroline Islands, issued by Methuen and Company of London in 1899. Christian entered the burial vaults at Nandawas during one or both of his visits and described what he found. He described human skeletal remains. He described those remains as remarkably large and out of proportion to the present inhabitants of Pohnpei. He provided no measurements. He provided no elaboration beyond those phrases. His account of what the vault chambers contained, their spatial arrangement, the number of individuals represented, the condition of the material, the degree of that disproportion stops at the description of the skeletal dimensions and does not continue. Here's where it gets strange. Christian was a trained ethnologist. The discipline requires systematic observation and documentation of physical evidence. When a trained ethnologist enters a space, finds skeletal material he characterizes as notable enough to describe in a published account, using specific comparative language, referencing the present population, the expected output is measurement and systematic description. Christian produced neither. He named the anomaly and then went quiet. The German colonial expedition documents this same pattern. The German colonial administration of Micronesia produced extensive administrative records, land surveys, contract documentation, infrastructure reports, ethnographic assessments. The bureaucratic apparatus documented what it encountered with systematic thoroughness. Administrative reports from German colonial operations in the early 1900s record that artifacts were removed from the Nan Madol site. The inventory of what was specifically removed from the Nandao was burial halts, what was taken, in what quantities, where it was transported, what became of it has not been published or declassified in any publicly accessible record. The current location of specific items removed from the burial vaults is not individually documented in any available archive. The gap is not in the German administrative record generally. The gap is specifically in the accounting for the Nandawas vault contents. At least 3 independent 19th century accounts follow the same structural pattern. Detailed approach to the vaults, description of entry, a specific halt at the point of skeletal dimensions, then silence. Christian's account halts there. The German administrative reports halt there. Additional 19th century visitor accounts do the same. The halt occurs at the same moment across independent observers with different purposes, different institutional affiliations, and different intended audiences for their writing. The pattern of consistent partial disclosure is not explained by coincidence in any analytical framework that accounts for the independence of the sources. One observer declining to elaborate could be reticence, or the limits of his descriptive framework, or editorial choice. 2 independent observers stopping at the same point could be coincidence. 3 independent observers from different national traditions, different professional disciplines, and different intended audiences, all halting at the same threshold of description, that is a pattern. Patterns in primary sources are data. What Christian found, what the actual dimensions were, what the degree of disproportion measured, how many individuals were represented, is not stated anywhere. The German artifact inventory from Nan Madol has not been released. The consistent terminus across independent accounts is documented. Its explanation is not. The Pohnpeian government designates Nan Madol as a protected ancestral site. External access for archaeological excavation requires consent from Pohnpeian cultural authorities. That consent has not been granted for excavation of the burial vaults. The stone capstones on Nandawas are in their original positions, placed by people who moved 50-ton basalt columns 20 miles across open water by a method no one has since demonstrated, and the vaults beneath those capstones have not been examined by any archaeological team. The capstones remain in place. Number 8. The Golden House. You are a young painter's apprentice in the studio of Domenico Ghirlandaio, working in Rome in the last decade of the 15th century. The year is 1488. Someone has given you a rope, and you know where the hole is. The hole is in the Oppian Hill, one of the 7 hills of classical Rome, and what you are descending into was sealed in approximately 109 AD when Emperor Trajan constructed a bathing complex over the northern wing of an emperor's private palace. The rooms below were filled with rubble to their ceilings before that structure was built, not abandoned, not buried by time, but deliberately packed with broken stone and earth as structural fill. The rooms have been sealed for approximately 1380 years. The air at the bottom of the rope is cold and completely still. The torch shows painted walls. The palace is the Domus Aurea, the golden house built by the Emperor Nero beginning in 64 ADA. Following the Great Fire of Rome that cleared approximately 300 acres of the city's central district, Nero built across the cleared land on a scale that requires a different category from the word building. Suetonius, writing in the lives of the 12 Caesars in the 2nd century AD, described among the palace's features a dining room with a ceiling that revolved continuously, scattering flowers and spraying perfume on the guests below. No such mechanism has been recovered in any documented excavation. Suetonius said it existed. Following Nero's death in 68 AD, his successors worked systematically to erase him from Rome's built environment. The artificial lake at the valley between the Esquiline and Caelian hills, part of the Domus Aurea complex, was drained. The Colosseum was built over it, completed in 80 AD. The surviving wings of the palace were buried under the Baths of Trajan, completed in 109 AD. The burial was engineered. The rooms were packed. The walls were used as structural support, and whatever occupied those rooms remained there. The paintings you are looking at have not been seen by any living person for more than a millennium. The style is unlike anything in any workshop tradition you know. Figures and architectural fantasies and grotesque combinations of animal and plant, forms flow across the vaulted ceilings with a confidence that makes their age irrelevant. This is an aesthetic vocabulary that predates your own tradition by 1400 years, Shaq, and it is more sophisticated than what you are being trained to produce. You do what anyone in your position would do. You find a piece of soot from your torch, and you sign your name on the ceiling. Michelangelo signed the ceiling of the Domus Aurea. Raphael signed it. Pinturicchio signed it. Domenico Ghirlandaio signed it. Those signatures in soot are still visible. These were not casual visitors. These were the working artists of the Renaissance, descending by rope into buried rooms to study what was there by torchlight, and what they took back to their workshops altered European painting for the next 2 centuries. The word grotesque from Pitera grotesca, painting found in the grottos, derives directly from these descents. Art historian Nicole Dakos documented the relationship between the Domus Aurea discoveries and Renaissance pictorial development in La Découverte de la Domus Aurea et la Formation des Grotesques à la Renaissance, published in 1969. Raphael adapted the visual vocabulary for the Vatican Loggia. Michelangelo incorporated Domus Aurea motifs into the Sistine Chapel ceiling. Dakos identifies specific panel-to-panel correspondences between buried frescoes and finished Renaissance commissions, visual evidence that the relationship was direct and deliberate. Neither artist credited the Domus Aurea as a source in any surviving correspondence. Their surviving correspondence is extensive and detailed, the kind that documents workshop influences and pictorial sources. The Domus Aurea does not appear in it. Here's where it gets strange. In the 19th century, when formal excavation of the Domus Aurea began under archaeological direction, certain rooms were entered and then sealed again. The rooms were sealed again. No analysis was published. The stated reason for resealing was structural instability. The rooms were too compromised to permit extended study without risk to excavators and to the fabric of the space. Archaeologists who entered those rooms before resealing produced accounts. Those accounts describe the fresco content as outside Roman convention. This phrase appears in 19th century excavation reports, referenced in secondary scholarly sources on the Domus Aurea's archaeological history. No primary analysis of what specifically those rooms contain has been published. The rooms were sealed. The accounts are referenced in secondary sources and not reproduced. As of 2024, approximately 30 of more than 300 identified rooms are accessible via the guided tour program managed by the Parco Archeologico del Colosseo, which opened the Domus Aurea site to visitors in 1999. The rooms sealed in the 19th century have not been re-entered in any documented investigation. The ongoing restoration and stabilization program managed by the Parco Archeologico WA does not include a published timeline for access to the sealed sections. Raphael looked at frescoes in this structure and then painted the Vatican Loggia. Michelangelo looked at them and then painted the Sistine Chapel ceiling. The specific walls those artists studied are documented by their signatures in soot. What the 19th century archaeologists described as outside Roman convention, in the rooms they then resealed those walls, have not been seen in any documented investigation in the current century. The phrase exists in secondary sources. The primary record exists in sealed rooms behind barriers, under the Oppian Hill, in a city that has been building continuously over them for 19 centuries and has not finished. Number 9. The Catacombs of Qam el-Shakafa. You are an Egyptian antiquities inspector working in the Qam el-Shakafa district of Alexandria, Egypt, and the year is 1900. A donkey pulling a cart has fallen through the ground, and you have been called to the site. The ground opened where the animal's weight hit a weakened surface, not a natural sinkhole, not a geological subsidence, but the structural failure of a sealed opening that had been concealed by accumulated street debris and building material for approximately 1,500 years. The donkey is gone. Down the opening the animal's fall created. A stone staircase is visible. Spiral stairs cut into the bedrock, descending into the dark. The air rising from the shaft is old and dry and absolutely cold. The staircase descends approximately 100 feet. At the bottom, in the bedrock beneath a neighborhood of Alexandria that has been continuously inhabited since antiquity, is the largest known Roman-era funerary complex in Egypt. 3 levels of tomb chambers extend from the base of the staircase. The complex dates from the 2nd century AD through the 4th century AD, the period of Roman administration, and was sealed, apparently deliberately and systematically, at some point in or around the late 4th century. From that sealing until the donkey fell through in 1900, no documented entry had occurred. On the first level, the guardian figures flanking the entrance to the main tomb chamber are Anubis, the jackal-headed Egyptian deity of embalming and transition to the afterlife. But the Anubis figures at Qam el-Shakafa are dressed in full Roman military armor. They carry a caduceus, the staff of Hermes, the Greek messenger deity who guided souls to the underworld. On the opposite wall stands Sobek, the crocodile-headed Egyptian god of the Nile, rendered in a Roman toga. Additional carved figures throughout the first level combine attributes of Horus, Ares, and Serapis, in specific configurations, particular pairings of iconographic elements from 3 distinct religious traditions that appear nowhere in any known Egyptian religious text, any known Greek religious text, or any known Roman religious text. No names are inscribed beside these figures. No corresponding religious literature in any language identifies what those specific combinations mean in ritual context. These figures are not the product of artistic license applied to recognizable gods. Syncretism in the ancient Mediterranean, the deliberate merging of deities from different traditions, produced documented figures with names and associated texts. The Anubis in Roman armor at Qam el-Shakafa has no name in any text. The Sobek in a toga has no name. The combinations of Horus, Ares, and Serapis configured on these walls have no parallel in any other known tomb or temple from any of the 3 traditions involved. The people who commissioned this tomb worshipped a theology that is documented only here, in this space, and nowhere else that has been found. The Hall of Caracalla on the 2nd level contains a separate chamber in which human skeletal remains were deposited alongside the skeletal remains of horses. The circumstances of that deposition, who placed them, under what religious or political context, at what specific point in the tomb's use history, have not been established in any published analysis. The identification of the human individuals has not been achieved. The horse's presence in a funerary chamber of this construction quality and this theological specificity has no documented parallel in Alexandrian funerary practice. Both the human individuals and the horses appear to have been deposited intentionally. What that intention was, and who carried it out, is not recorded in any available source from either tradition represented elsewhere in the tomb. Here's where it gets strange. The 3rd level of the catacomb extends below the 2nd, carved deeper into the Alexandria bedrock. Frescoes were noted on its walls during the initial 1900 investigation, described in early 20th century reports as depicting funerary imagery extending the hybrid theological program visible on the upper levels. Before those frescoes could be systematically documented and photographed, the 3rd level flooded. Alexandria's groundwater table, which has been rising throughout the 20th century due to the city's expansion and the end of ancient drainage management, inundated the lower chamber. It has been underwater since before 1940, and the water level has not receded. In the 1990s, a dive team entered the flooded 3rd level on behalf of the Egyptian Antiquities Organization. A preliminary report was produced. That report was not published. The divers described the frescoes of the 3rd level as depicting scenes that diverge from the funerary conventions of both Egyptian and Roman tradition. the same pattern as the hybrid figures on the first level, extended into subject matter that the preliminary report characterized as requiring further documentation. No further documentation was produced. The Egyptian Antiquities Organization has not released the preliminary report. It is held in the organization's files. No publicly accessible archive contains it. The dive team's characterization of what they saw frescoes depicting subject matter outside both traditions is described in secondary sources that reference the report's existence. Those secondary sources do not reproduce its contents. The frescoes are there, under approximately 20 to 30 feet of groundwater, in a flooded chamber beneath a neighborhood of Alexandria where the water table has been rising for a century. They were seen once, in the 1990s, by a dive team whose findings were submitted in an unpublished report to an organization that has not released it. The hybrid figures on the first level, Anubis in Roman armor, Sobek in a toga, Horus and Ares and Serapis combined in configurations that appear in no ancient text, are now illuminated for visitors by lights installed for the tour program. Their theological meaning is recorded in no surviving ancient religious literature. The third level is underwater. The report from the people who descended into it is in an Egyptian Antiquities Organization file. Number 10. The Sealed Galleries. You are Jean-Marie Chauvet, a speleologist employed by the French Ministry of Cultural Affairs as a cave security officer for the Ardèche Department of southern France. The year is 1994. It is December 18th. You and your two colleagues, Iliette Brunel and Christian Hilaire, are conducting a routine survey of the limestone cliff faces above the Ardèche River Gorge, near the village of Valenpont d'Arc, when you notice a draft. Cold air moving through a crack in the rock face. In karst landscapes, a draft means void space behind the rock, a cave system large enough to maintain its own air pressure differential with the exterior. You have been exploring these cliffs on weekends and survey days for years. You know what a draft means. You and Brunel and Hilaire spend the next several hours widening the crack by hand, clearing debris, and then rigging a ladder improvised from electrical cable. You descend into whatever is behind the rock. The air at the bottom is cold and old and absolutely still. The cave floor is undisturbed calcite and sediment. The bones of Pleistocene cave bears lie in the positions they occupied when the animals died. The stalactites and stalagmites are intact. Nothing has been in here since the entrance sealed. The geology indicates it closed a very long time ago. Then the torches hit the walls. The art covers the walls and ceilings of the main chambers. Lions in charcoal, their bulk conveyed with a visual weight that requires compositional planning. Horses in motion, their legs rendered in overlapping sequences that imply movement across the stone surface. Woolly rhinoceroses charging, with the anatomical specificity of artists working from direct observation of living animals. Cave bears. Aurochs, a panel of mammoths in red ochre. The figures are not scattered or isolated. They are organized into compositional groups with implied spatial relationships, with perspective indicated by foreshortening the rendering of forms at angles to the picture plane that requires an understanding of how three-dimensional objects project onto two-dimensional surfaces. Uranium series dating and radiocarbon analysis of the charcoal, confirmed by the Oxford Radiocarbon Accelerator Unit and multiple independent laboratories, and published in Nature in 1995 by Jean Klotz and colleagues, place the figures at 36,000 to 33,000 years of age. This is the oldest confirmed figurative art in the human archaeological record by approximately 10,000 years over the next oldest known examples. The techniques used in its production, foreshortening, perspective, compositional organization with implied depth, are not known to reappear in the archaeological record until tens of thousands of years later. In one chamber, at a natural vertical fissure where the limestone has split, there is a figure. The lower portion is a human female form. A triangular shape consistent with the Venus figurine tradition in Upper Paleolithic art, documented across multiple European sites of this period. The lower half is human. The upper portion transitions into the body and head of a bison. The junction is at the fissure, the split in the rock, as if the figure is emerging from within the stone. In the archaeological literature, this figure is classified as a therianthrope, a figure that is part human, part animal. It is the only known example of this specific configuration, female human lower body, bison upper body, emerging from a rock fissure in any Upper Paleolithic cave art site on record. No published analysis has formally characterized the ritual or narrative context of this figure. No parallel has been identified in any site. Here's where it gets strange. In interviews given to French television and print media in 1995 and 1996, Chauvet, Brunel, and Hilaire each described their physical responses to the deeper sections of the cave on the night of discovery. The accounts were given independently, without coordination. Chauvet described the feeling of being watched from the back of the cave. Brunel described not wanting to go further, not because the passage was difficult. Hilaire described a kind of fear that I have not felt in any other cave, and I have been in hundreds. 3 experienced speleologists, separately interviewed, describing the same category of nonspecific physical response, and Hilaire's qualifier as primary evidence. Hundreds of caves, and this one produced a response without parallel. In 1995, the French Ministry of Culture installed a concrete and steel door with a climate-controlled airlock at the cave entrance. Entry is restricted to a small number of authorized researchers per year. Chauvet, Brunel, and Hilaire, the 3 people who found this cave, require written authorization from the Ministry of Cultural Affairs to enter it. The main chambers have been photographed in their entirety by the Ministry of Culture's documentation team. Werner Herzog filmed inside the cave in 2010 with ministry permission, producing the documentary Cave of Forgotten Dreams. The deeper galleries, those accessed by Chauvet, Brunel, and Hilaire on the first night, from which all 3 described independent physical responses that none of them has attributed to any other cave, have not appeared in any documentation project. They are described in the preliminary report submitted by the Discovery team to the French Ministry of Culture in early 1995. The ministry has confirmed the report's existence. The report has not been released. The steel door is in the cliff face above the Ardèche River Gorge. The deeper galleries have not been entered since December 18, 1994. The therianthrope, the bison-headed figure emerging from the fissure in the limestone, stands in permanent dark. The charcoal used to draw it is 36,000 years old. These 10 chambers span 5 continents and 500,000 years of human activity. In each one, the portion that remains sealed is the portion that would answer the question the open portion raises. The pattern holds across 430,000 years of prehistory and a filing cabinet in Paris. Subscribe if this is the kind of history that doesn't make the textbooks. Like this video if you made it to the end, it tells us to keep going. Leave a comment with where in the world you're watching from. We read every one.